everybody doing?
All right.
How is it that I'm following John Nichols? Oh, yeah, it's like, how does he go first? I don't understand how. So first of all, I want to thank John for setting the bar extraordinarily high. And I want to thank Maria for all of the work that you've done to, I think, help bring the organization to the stage that really all of humanity is asking for. So thank you for your leadership and for bringing the convention here to the Bay Area, because we definitely needed an assemblage of leftists to show us that what's happening here in the Bay Area is not alone, and that there are other folks in other corners of the country struggling and fighting the good fight. I also want to thank you all for gathering as socialists, because I think, like John mentioned, it's a word, it's a label, it's an identity that hasn't been allowed to sort of play the central role in US politics that it could and should. How many people here were politically active in 1969? I was born in 1960. Which, just to be clear, in some left spaces makes me a young person, but in the world I am not a young person, and I have the hairline to prove that. But I hold on strongly to having been born in 1969. As people know, it's the year where when humanity apparently walked on the moon. Also the year that the Mets won the World Series and the Jets won the NFL championship. Two underdog teams doing what was considered to be impossible. That part of my childhood I hold on to, because the other part, having been born in 1969, means that I was a child of Ronald Reagan. This is the appropriate moment to hiss. Hissing during the mention of Ronald Reagan's name is always fine. And for me, growing up just outside of Philadelphia, seeing the world through the eyes of my Southern parents who grew up in the segregated South, went to Spelman and Morehouse started in 1960, so we're there at a pivotal moment of the civil rights struggle. Thinking that the world had some fundamental flaws was not a great leap of consciousness. But thinking that there was something better out there was not anything that was in the political discourse during the 1980s. And for folks who are younger than me, what you may not have been privy to is really that period was a period where Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, John was right, you all are quick studies, as they say. But not only did they engage in a process of trying to undermine socialist experiments, national liberation movements around the globe, but they also engaged in an ideological struggle to convince all of us that capitalism wasn't only the best way to organize an economy, it wasn't the best way to organize a society, right? It was the only way. There is no alternative, right? So if you want something better, you are not only naive and foolish, but you're ultimately taking on a task that will never be accomplished, right? So for me, to be in a room of comrades identifying as socialists is heartwarming. And I'm reminded of a statement that Amilcar Cabral, the amazing revolutionary from Cape Verde Guinea-Bissau said when he was in Cuba. And he made the point that he referred to the people in the assemblage as comrades, as opposed to referring to people as brother and sister, because as brother and sister we have no choice as to how it is that we relate to one another. But as comrades, we've made a deliberate choice to walk a similar path with one another. And this is an astonishing time for us to be walking this path. As John mentioned, there are incredible opportunities that sit on top of overlapping crises that threaten the future of humanity on this planet. Right? The Republicans held a gun at the head of the federal government, shut down the federal government because they didn't want to make advances on healthcare reform and requiring that people have healthcare insurance. In the midst of that, clearly, they thought that it was of strategic national importance to keep the congressional gym open while denying access to food stamps and nutritional programs for single mothers. We're living at a time where the president is now considering whether or not to grant approval to the opening up of the Keystone Pipeline, right? Where all legitimate scientific evidence has clearly indicated that our collective dependence upon fossil fuels is leading us into a chicken race, right? Where we are running headlong into ecological catastrophe. And rather than looking to alternative fuel options, the ruling class is continuing to try to frack and to extract dangerous fossil fuels that will only emit more carbon into the atmosphere. Right? These are astonishing times. And it happens at big, broad levels, but then it's also incredibly small and intimate. As Maria mentioned, I make my home now in San Francisco, the home of the World Series champion San Francisco Giants.
All right!
We have another week. We have another week. And oftentimes, you know, when I have the opportunity to leave San Francisco, people say, well, you all organize there? Like, what are you talking about? San Francisco is like the bastion of left progressive politics, right? Over the last 3 years, the San Francisco School District has eliminated the yellow school bus service for kids in the public school system in San Francisco. The thinking has been that kids will be able to get onto the public bus system to transport themselves to and from school. During that same period of time, the San Francisco Transportation Agency has raised the transit costs for young people by more than 200%. So you have a process where public free transit has been eliminated, coupled with the raising of the cost to use that transportation, right? And then, as if that wasn't enough, the San Francisco city government has decided to place armed police officers on the buses to check whether or not people have paid their fare. This resulted a year and a half ago in a young man, African-American young man, 19 years old, Kenneth Harding, who, after getting on the bus, not having the money to pay, got off the bus and was confronted by several San Francisco police officers. Out of fear, because he had had previous interactions with the criminal justice system, he ran. And the San Francisco police officers wound up shooting him in the back and killing him. Now, it's an extreme story, but what's astonishing about these times is that story is not out of the ordinary for the experience of too many people in this country. Right? in the midst of all of these dynamics, the Republican Party is engaged in a factional fight where Newt Gingrich and John Boehner actually seem like reasonable people that we would want to engage with, right? Meanwhile, Sarah Palin, Ted Cruz, whoever else, are running an insurgent faction of the party that is paralyzing that party of the right. Now, for the Democratic Party, as if that's our vehicle to liberation, but there are clearly opportunities that are being missed, but I would argue that there are also opportunities that the left is also missing. And in some very important ways, I think, while it is critical for us to be paying attention to institutional politics in the United States, it's too easy for us to get caught up in the tally counting of the number of members of the Progressive Congressional Caucus, or did this policy pass, or did this legislator say an inappropriate or an appropriate thing. Ultimately, as leftists, we have to think about the task of shifting the balance of power. And that's a task that doesn't necessarily happen on the scoreboard of policy legislation and electoral victories right now. Some of our fight has to be taking place on the ground, building up the capacity of people in everyday neighborhoods to put pressure on their congressional representatives, to put pressure on city council members, to become city council members, but ultimately to develop organization and develop capacity that allows us to be able to exercise the power to be able to construct a very different world. Right? Now, within that, I think that there are some reasons for us to be extraordinarily happy. Going back to the beginning of 2010, there's no reasonable person that would have anticipated that millions of people were going to wind up taking to the streets throughout North Africa and the Middle East and ultimately ousting dictators that had been supported by the US government for more than 3 decades. There was no reasonable expectation that that was going to happen, but people did it. People did it. Then, all of a sudden in the belly of the beast, in Wisconsin and then New York, people wound up taking to public space to say that not only is the course of the world moving in a bad direction, but ultimately I want to see things go in a different direction, right? People wound up doing extraordinary things. And then over the last couple of years, there have been lots of hand-wringing and name-calling about, well, is Occupy dead? And what is going to happen next? And I think the question of what is going to happen next is being very clearly answered by domestic workers, by fast food workers, by undocumented immigrants, by people in the California prison system, all throughout this country, people who have not been thought of as central actors, people who have not been asked to come in to testify at congressional hearings, people who are often not found on the pages of newspapers or in channels of television, but people who wind up being the undergirding of our economy, the people who have ultimately borne the brunt of the subprime mortgage crisis, the increase of the prison industrial complex and the occupying of our communities by police departments. Those people have stood up and said, we don't know what the better way is, but we know this is not the route that we're going to take. And so people have started to take incredible action, right? I mean, the fast food workers' strikes, the organizing of the Walmart workers, undocumented immigrants trying to cross back into the United States wearing their graduation garb. What is that about, right? Like, all of that is happening in a context where many folks from our communities just 5 years ago would have said it's too dangerous. maybe that's some stuff that like young white anarchists can do. But ultimately, that's too risky for us. And more what people are seeing is that what's too risky is continuing to follow the route of neoliberalism. And I heard somebody say once that mass movements are like the wind. Right? Oftentimes, I think in left and progressive circles, there can be discussions about, well, what's the movement building work that we're engaged in? And my experience is that we don't do work as leftists building the movement. The movement winds up happening. We don't always know where the spark is going to come from. But somebody said once, well, once the spark happens, the question I think for leftists is, well, what is to be done? Right? What is to be done? And I would say that there's a particular task for leftists at this particular moment that is similar, but distinct from the task of progressives, of folks who are engaged in mass organizations. And I would say that there are two particular tasks that leftists at this moment have to take up. The first is very clearly articulating what is our vision of a better world. In 2001, folks came together in the global south to argue against the hegemony of TINA, the idea that there is no alternative, and organized the World Social Forum, right, in opposition to the World Economic Forum. And do people remember what the slogan of the World Social Forum process was? Another world is possible, right? Another world is possible. But as leftists, the task that we take up is to help articulate, to help sharpen our vision of what that better world is, right? Because even in as much as people are on the streets organizing, knocking on doors, just today marching in the streets of Oakland, there's a sense that what we have right now is not what we deserve. And there's a hope that there could be something better, but there's not necessarily a confidence about that. And I would argue that what John is saying is absolutely right, that our carrying the tradition of socialism is a critically important thing, but the legacy of 30 years of neoliberal assault is not just that there's income inequality, but it's also that there's a lack of confidence amongst leftists that we can actually win, that we can actually construct a better world on a democratic basis with the people in our communities, in our country, and around the globe. And I think as leftists, we have to begin sharpening that articulation. As Maria mentioned, I had the opportunity with Tanya Lee to interview 150 organizers and activists during 2012. We went around the country and organized or interviewed folks in 35 communities across the country. And the questions were centrally, what's your assessment of this particular moment in history? What do you see as the relative strengths and weaknesses of the movement right now? And what are your thoughts about how we should move forward? And at the beginning, we asked some basic demographic questions that we thought would help us index. You know, what is it that young people said? What is it that Latinos said? What is it that different folks said? And one of the questions that we asked people was, how do you identify politically? We thought it was going to be a simple demographic question. We'd be able to break out, here's what the socialists said, here's what the anarchists said. The thing that I think both Tanya and I were incredibly surprised by the results of it, in that 65% of the people that we interviewed identified in some form or fashion or flavor as an anti-capitalist, which is incredibly exciting. Right? We had no sense that that was going to be true when we walked into selecting people who we interviewed. The interview, the results, had now been written up and you can find them at eartothegroundproject.org. But we list a bunch of the people that we interviewed. We had no sense that so many people were going to think about themselves as anti-capitalist. What was interesting, though, was that in that grouping of roughly 100 people who identified as anti-capitalists, there was no single term that more than 3 people selected. There were a lot of adjectives, right? I'm a democratic, revolutionary, third world, internationalist, socialist. I am a revolutionary, democratic, socialist of the third world. Like, there were a lot of configurations of some of the similar adjectives, but nevertheless, there wasn't a particular label that everybody wound up using. And Tanya's and my takeaway from that was that in some very important ways, the labels that we often wind up using to describe our politics are really vestiges of the Cold War. And that for especially a lot of people who have been politicized since the fall of the Soviet Union, both young people are more open to ideas of socialism, but we also don't know what it is. And a large part of what we heard from people is that fighting the good fight is not enough. The forces that we are standing up against have more money, have more access to resources, are more connected, and they have a plan. It's not enough for us to be mad. We have to have clear vision of where it is that we're going, and I would argue that the left plays a very particular role in that. So one task, I would argue, for all of us to think about at this period is, what is our vision of the better world? And ultimately, how can we begin engaging in discussion with folks on the front lines who are engaged in their respective struggles so that they begin to take that vision and it can inform the struggles that are taking place right now. One quick example that I think could qualitatively change some of the struggles that are happening on the streets. Many people have started talking about the fight for legalization and immigrant rights as a new branch of the civil rights movement in the United States, and I'm sure Kathy's going to talk more about this. But to me, what would be interesting is, what would it be for there to be a solid intersection where the immigrant rights movement sees itself connected to the 20,000 prisoners in the California prison system who wound up going on hunger strike. So that it's not just a question of getting citizenship, getting legalization, but it's a question of the dehumanization and the rising prison industrial complex that's affecting all of our society, right? The folks who are shutting down ICE, the folks who are going into the detention centers, the folks who are engaged in the hunger strikes, don't have the resources right now to be able to take up that cross-movement discussion. I think that that's a particular role and responsibility of the left, and I think that we need to take that up and take that seriously. The second aspect, I think, of our tasks is to engage in the fights. It's easy, I think, for us to think that, well, you know what, I'm not a paid organizer. I'm not engaged in any of the communities that are taking on these particular struggles right now. But having worked at a community organization of working class African Americans and Latinos in San Francisco, I know that whenever we got volunteers who came in to say, I'm willing to do anything. I'm willing to file papers. I'm willing to answer phone calls. I'm willing to organize house meetings amongst my friends so that your members can come and talk about building a movement that crosses out of the particular sectors that you're engaged in right now. It was like a breath of fresh air. And I think it's not only an incredible opportunity for leftists to be able to do that, because to be clear, it's only leftists who are going to do that. Nobody else. But not only is it an incredible opportunity for folks to do that, but it also, I think, deepens our political orientation about what's possible. And so quickly I want to tell one story about a member that I got a chance to work with at Power. Her name's Gloria, undocumented immigrant from Mexico. She was born and raised in Oaxaca. Got involved with Power as we were struggling to pass the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, which was just passed a few weeks ago at the state legislature. And Gloria came in with incredibly sharp politics. Her family was connected to the strikes in 1968 in Mexico City. But Gloria came here because she was trying to make a better life for herself and particularly for her kids. And so she was interested in getting involved in Power because we were one of the only organizations that was trying to make space for undocumented people to engage in the fights around domestic workers and immigrant rights. But she also thought we were a little bit crazy. Engage in all this direct action, you're going and yelling at city council members, and the sheriffs would come. They had batons and guns, and she made compelling arguments about why it was not entirely appropriate for her and a lot of people like her to engage in direct actions. But Gloria continued to come back to the organization, go through the political education sessions. She saw a bunch of the staff and other leaders engaging in political action. And so then a couple of the members at Power participated in the Undocubus that people might remember wound up traveling throughout the South and ultimately culminated in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the Democratic Party was holding its presidential coronation, or whatever terminology they're using. And there, folks wound up engaging in civil disobedience by locking down some of the intersections leading out to the convention center. Gloria was there, and she wound up participating in the civil disobedience. And it was incredibly scary for all of us. You know, we got a phone call that she was locked up. Initially, the authorities in North Carolina were threatening to deport everybody who was undocumented. Her kids, Gloria had left her kids with some of the staff members at Power, so we were a little bit concerned that we had custody of a 9 and 13-year-old all of a sudden. And we were ultimately able to get Gloria and all the other undocumented folks out. But it wasn't until Gloria wound up coming back to San Francisco that we all understood the transformation that had taken place. Gloria came back and she said, you know, I used to be scared of them. They have guns, they have batons, they have prisons, they have bombs. But we have the people. We have the people. And when we get organized, there's nothing that they can do. And once you pull back the curtain, what is somewhat poetic, once you pull back the curtain, you see that they're just little people trying to defend privileges and power that they don't deserve. And Gloria is a different person now. And she has inspired me, has inspired lots of folks that have made a lifetime commitment to this work. But that commitment becomes different when it's connected to people who are making decisions that could very easily jeopardize their immediate livelihoods. And so I would encourage each and every one of you to take up the project of actively building democratic, fighting organizations of people, whether it's fast food workers, domestic workers, undocumented folks, unemployed workers, what have you. But our task at this moment is to develop vision and develop the capacity to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are standing in front of us. In 2006, I'll close with this. In 2006, I had the opportunity to go to Venezuela to participate in the World Social Forum. And I got a chance to hear Hugo Chavez speak. And he got up, he started off saying that he wasn't going to speak long because he had so yeah. 45 minutes later he was singing. And then as he got to the conclusion, he said that, previous generations of revolutionaries, of socialists have had the luxury of thinking in terms of decades, scores of years, even centuries. But that if only because of the ecological crisis, that socialists of this period have to accelerate our capacity to be able to make change. Which is not to say that we can skip steps, which is not to say that things are always going to come easily, but it is to say that we have to take ourselves seriously because people in our communities are looking to us. They may not always know that we're the people, but people are looking for a left even if they don't know that we are the left that they're looking for. And so it's time for us to stand up and present ourselves as people who are not offering unaccountable leadership, but who are rolling up our sleeves and helping to build a better world with the people who are on the front lines. Thanks.